Okay, but what if we didn't make a video at all, we just made a picture? Like, motion tracking can become difficult then, but how can we still put the element into our scene, so to speak, in such a way that everything looks realistic and coherent? Well, we can use a software called fSpy, and you can download that for free from the internet. And while we're at it, we'll also download the fSpy add-on for Blender directly. This is version 1.0.3, and again, make sure that you download it as a zip file. And as I said, for me, that means downloading it with Google Chrome and not with Safari. Now, when we've done these things, we open fSpy, and now we have the possibility to drop an image in here. This is basically a photo that I took from the same location, which I also took for our custom HDRI, which I already showed you in section 4, I believe. And here in fSpy, we basically just have to grab these lines here and align them in the way that it looks the best. Now, what we want to find out here is the direction in which our vanishing point is moving. So that's the focal length of the camera and the position of the camera in relation to the scene. That means we'll just do it like this, and we can see now that this is our vanishing point. It goes a bit too high for us in terms of feeling, and that means that we can do the whole thing, but we can also take this here now, for example, and adjust the whole thing a tiny bit. Now, unfortunately, we don't have very straight lines here right now with which we can do that. So if you have straight lines somewhere, for example, you photographed a wall and you can use the edges of the wall as a reference point, so to speak, then it definitely makes sense to go into great detail and really take a closer look. Now, if we want to align the point here exactly with the point back here, you can also press Shift, and then we can go in here precisely, and we can move our mouse exactly here. We can also do the same thing back here, and that will align the whole thing right here on this edge. So we do Shift, left click, and you can work a bit more precisely like that. And once we've done this whole thing, we go to File up here, and then we do Save As, but we don't say Export, we only save our project. Now we're gonna pop this project onto our desktop, and we call it Philosophicum Parking Lot fSpy, because that's what I took in the parking lot at the Philosophicum in Gießen. So I'm going to save this, then we can close this app, and we don't have to save the project now. In fSpy, however, you can even load an example project, which is basically included. Now here we see these hard edges, and then you can see that those hard edges alone are really mathematically accurate. So here it would make perfect sense to sort of go in and then do Shift left click and align the whole thing very precisely. In our case, however, it's not really the case because I didn't make a particularly suitable image for that, and we have our custom HDRI for that as well. So that will balance out in realism when I start working on it. Anyway, we're in Blender now. We're going to install the fSpy add-on. So we're going to do Command comma, go to add-ons, we search for 1.0.3, say install add-on, and now you can see it all works wonderfully. When all this happened, I can type fSpy first, then check the box here, and then we can go to File on the top, and when you go to Import, you can see fSpy at the bottom. You can now see that .fSpy is the file type that is supported. That's why I said you didn't need to export, but you could just save it as an fSpy file. That means we can now import our fSpy points here, and that's what we're doing now, and this is the result. And now you can see we have our cube, our cameras, everything is nicely aligned. However, you can see that the camera has now been added on top, so we can remove the other camera. And we can also turn off the light because we don't need that either. We have everything in our custom HDRI. However, we now want the camera and the cube to be moved 1 meter up because then we actually have our ground on the center point and also on the world ground plane. So we select both, we do GZ1, and then you can go into the camera here again, and then we can press Shift A, add a plane, S4, and we make it a bit larger, and we can start with the exposure here. Now, what do I mean by exposure? Well, let's get into the shader editor here and change the whole thing from object to world. Now we do Shift A, environment texture, the color goes to the background, we'll get the HDRI, which I showed you in section 4, which I practically did myself with my cell phone. Although, I mean, technically this isn't an HDRI, it's a panorama picture, but that's almost the same anyway, because I said we shot it in the same location. So we can go in for the rendered view, so we can see to what extent we still have to shoot it now, and then we do Control T, and then with the Z rotation will be adjusted so that everything fits well with the cars in the back. Then we go to the add-on settings and we look for the HDRI sun aligner on here, and then we press N on our keyboard, HDRI sun aligner, calculate sun position, preview, that's the sun right there, we do add new sun, and we have the right exposure. Now, how are we going to make the HDRI in the background not get on our nerves like it is now? Well, we can just go to the render properties, go down here, and then we go to film, and we say transparent. Now all we have to do is set the shadow catcher, and I've already shown you here when we're in cycles, that's pretty easy. We simply select our plane, go to the object properties under visibility, say shadow catcher, and everything works wonderfully. Now, if we don't want to render the whole thing in cycles but in Eevee, it's a bit more difficult. I think I've already shown you the shader for that. We're going to replicate that very briefly, and then of course we can just color our shadow just to show that it's possible. I'll take a picture of Ton Roosendaal in our shadow, and you know why? Because I can. Exactly. That means we have a one shadow here now, and this shadow even has alpha information. And then, for example, if I enter S100, I would have a shadow consisting of many Ton Roosendaals. Of course, it's complete nonsense, but of course you can also get creative with this yourself. This means that we can now just bring any model in here and have some fun with them. Our camera was renamed to Philosophy for the parking lot fSpy.fSpy, and the background image was simply loaded in here. We now want to include this background image in our compositor, so we want Philosophy parking fSpy.fSpy as an image, and then we want to pack the whole thing on top of each other with an alpha over node. The image goes into the image here, and we just render the whole thing, and now we don't see our object above our render, and that's because we made a small mistake. We have to switch the whole thing in the alpha over node, and now we have our objects above our render, and we can now save it as an image. That means simply go to Image Save As at the top, and we can save the whole thing as fSpy demo Eevee, and as a counterexample, we want want to render the whole thing again briefly in cycles. In cycles, as you know, we don't have to do much apart from setting the shadow catcher correctly. And that means we go to the object properties here, we go down to visibility, we say shadow capture, and then render the whole thing as normal. With a boring old principal BSDF on the base color, we can now adjust everything a little bit here. If we want to make the base color blue, for example, we have this bounce light from the base color accordingly. Because the light here is obviously coming from the sun and shows that it's here in the path tracing engine, so there's also bounce light. That means that even if we leave the color white here, we can see on our object that the background is white. However, the background is not white, but rather gray. Now, how can we put an image texture on here? Well, we say image texture here, we select our picture here, we take the philosophy parking lot, for example, then we do the picture of Roosendaal, we do shadow capture, that's why they look like this, and we can just go into our camera view and say U, and then project from view, bang, and that actually fixes all our problems. And if we now look at this in cycles, then we can see that we actually have the reflection from the floor here, as we would expect, and that's how you deal with it. Now, the image, when we render it, we want to make sure that the samples are at 4096 samples exactly here, so I'm gonna put that in on the minimum and the maximum. Oh yeah, and we must have noticed that I forgot to change the shadow catcher, so let's make that change real quickly. There we go, and now we have our cycles render as a contrast to our Eevee render. That was it for this lecture. Thank you all for watching, and see you in the next one. Later, guys.